The papers on the table had my name on them. My son's pen was already moving. And the woman sitting across from him, my daughter-in-law, was smiling the way people smile when they've already won. I had been an accountant for 35 years. I knew exactly what those documents meant. And I knew something else, too, tucked inside the lining of my coat, was the only thing standing between me and disappearing forever. The papers on the table had my name on them. My son's pen was already moving. I remember thinking how strange it was the way Ryan held that pen. Not the way you hold something you're uncertain about, the way you hold something you've already decided belongs to you. The office smelled like old wood and central heating, the kind of warmth that feels borrowed rather than real. Outside the tall windows, Portland was doing what Portland does in October gray sky. Steady drizzle, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, just shows up and stays. I had lived in this city for most of my life. I knew that rain, but sitting in that chair, across that table, nothing felt familiar. Ryan sat to my left, slightly forward in his seat, his posture easy and relaxed in the way that people are relaxed when they believe the outcome has already been decided. Diane, his wife of 14 years, sat beside him. She had her hands folded in her lap and a small, steady smile on her face, the kind of smile that isn't really about happiness, it's about patience, the patience of someone waiting for a process to finish. I watched them both and said nothing. The man across from us, a notary whose name I had already forgotten because Ryan had introduced him too quickly and moved on, was sorting through a stack of documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this every day, and had long since stopped wondering what the papers actually meant to the people who signed them. But I knew what they meant. I had spent 35 years as a lead accountant for Callahan & Sons Construction, the company my husband Frank built from the ground up, starting with nothing more than a used pickup truck and a reputation for showing up on time. 35 years of reading documents that looked simple on the surface and meant everything underneath. Lease agreements, asset transfers, liability waivers, power of attorney. I recognized the format before I could read the specific language. The structured paragraphs, the signature lines, the careful legal phrasing designed to sound protective while quietly shifting control from one set of hands to another. My hands, in this case, to Ryan's. He hadn't told me that was what we were coming here for. He had knocked on my door that morning at 8:15, already dressed, already carrying my coat over his arm. He said there was a quick errand, some paperwork left over from the estate that needed to be updated. He said it wouldn't take long. He said I didn't need to bring anything. I noticed even then that he didn't ask me if I wanted to come. He assumed. Diane had been waiting in the car with the engine running. She greeted me with that same practiced smile, asked if I'd slept well, commented on the weather. By the time I realized we had driven past the medical district and into the legal quarter of downtown Portland, we were already pulling into a parking garage. Now, sitting in this chair, I studied the documents from across the table without reaching for them. A habit from decades of professional caution. You understand a document before you touch it, because the moment your hands are on it, other people start to assume things. The top sheet had my full name printed in clean block letters, Margaret Ann Callahan. Below it, a date. Below that, language I recognized immediately. Durable power of attorney. Ryan's pen paused for just a moment. He glanced up at me, and there was something in that glance brief, almost imperceptible, that told me he had rehearsed this moment. He had imagined how I would sit, what I would say, whether I would understand what was happening. He had built a version of this scene in his mind, and he was checking to see if reality matched it. I gave him nothing. I kept my face still, my hands in my lap, my breathing even. 35 years of sitting across tables from people who wanted something had taught me that the most powerful thing you can do in any negotiation is let the other side believe they are winning. But behind that stillness, my mind was already working. 4 decades of reading numbers, contracts, and the small, careful lies that people hide inside official language, all of it was telling me the same thing with absolute clarity. This was not a routine update. This was not paperwork left over from the estate. This was a transfer. Quiet, legal, and designed to look like nothing more than a son taking care of his mother. I looked at Ryan, then at Diane, then at the pen moving across the bottom of the page. And I thought about Frank. Not about what had happened to him, not yet, but about who he was, the kind of man who understood, perhaps better than I ever gave him credit for, that the people we love are not always the people we think they are. The kind of man who spent 44 years making sure I never had to face something like this alone. To tell you how I ended up in that chair, I have to tell you about him first. Frank Callahan was the kind of man who checked the weather before he made any decision, big or small. Before a job site visit, before a Saturday drive, before planting anything in the backyard garden, he tended with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything else. He wasn't superstitious about it. He was practical. Frank believed that you couldn't control what the world handed you, but you could always make sure you weren't caught off guard by something you could have seen coming. That was the philosophy he built his life on. And for 44 years, it was the philosophy he built our life on together. We met in the spring of 1978 at a community fundraiser in Northeast Portland. I was 26, working my first real accounting job at a small manufacturing firm, still figuring out what kind of life I wanted. Frank was 29, running a two-man crew out of a second-hand pickup truck, taking whatever construction work he could find. He wasn't impressive in the way that makes people stop and stare. He was impressive in the quieter way, the kind you only notice after you've been paying attention for a while. He asked me to dance. I said yes. By the end of the night, he had told me about every job he'd ever worked, every mistake he'd ever made on a site, and exactly what he planned to do differently going forward. Most men that age talked about what they wanted. Frank talked about what he was going to do. There's a difference, and I recognized it immediately. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a church in the Selwood neighborhood with about 40 guests and a reception in his mother's backyard. Nothing fancy. Frank said we could have a bigger celebration once the business turned its first real profit. True to his word, on our 5th anniversary, he took me to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Portland and ordered a bottle of wine I still remember the label of. Callahan & Sons Construction grew the way Frank grew everything steadily, carefully, without shortcuts. He started with residential work, small additions and repairs, building a reputation one satisfied customer at a time. By the time Ryan was born, in 1983, we had a crew of 12 and a proper office on the east side of the city. By the time Ryan started high school, the company had contracts with 3 of the largest commercial developers in Oregon. Frank was proud of what he built. But if I'm being honest, the thing he was proudest of was the idea of passing it on. Ryan was our only child, and Frank poured into him the same steady attention he gave everything else that mattered to him. Saturday mornings at job sites, learning the names of tools before he was old enough to use them. Summer afternoons going over blueprints at the kitchen table. Frank had a vision of what Callahan & Sons could become in the next generation, and that vision had Ryan's name on it from very early on. What Frank didn't account for, because it wasn't something you could check the weather for, was the way certain kinds of ease can quietly reshape a person over time. Ryan never struggled the way Frank had. He never had to. The house was already there. The company was already there. The reputation, the contracts, the crew, all of it waiting. And somewhere between the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from job sites and the man who eventually took Frank's chair at the head of the conference table, something shifted in ways that were too gradual to name and too easy to explain away as simply growing up. But that came later. For most of Ryan's childhood and into his early adult years, Frank's faith in him was complete and unquestioned. And I loved Frank too much, and believed in his judgment too deeply, to look at that faith too carefully. The years move the way good years do, faster than you expect, fuller than you remember. Frank turned 60, then 65. He still showed up at job sites on Tuesdays, still checked the weather every morning, still came to bed each night smelling faintly of sawdust and the particular brand of hand soap he'd used for 30 years because he said there was no point changing something that worked. Then came the diagnosis. Not sudden. Frank's health had been signaling something was wrong for the better part of a year before the doctors gave it a name. He handled the news the way he handled everything. He sat with it quietly for a day, and then he started making a list of what needed to be done. He transferred formal ownership of Callahan & Sons to Ryan 18 months before he passed. He said it was the right time, that the transition would be cleaner while he was still there to oversee it. Ryan accepted the responsibility with what looked like gratitude. There were handshakes and a quiet dinner, and Frank spent the next several months making sure every piece of knowledge he'd accumulated over 4 decades was written down and passed on. I watched all of it from close enough to see everything and far enough to say very little, because Frank had made his decision, and Frank's decisions were not made lightly. In his final weeks, he didn't talk much about the business. He talked about the garden, about places he wished we'd traveled to, about small memories from early in our marriage that I had half forgotten. He held my hand more than he spoke. On one of the last clear evenings, when the morphine hadn't yet taken the sharpness from his eyes, he turned to me and said something I have thought about nearly every day since. His grip tightened around my fingers, still firm, still frank, even then. "Take care of the books, Peggy," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone change the numbers." He showed up 3 days after the service with groceries I didn't ask for, and a smile I didn't quite recognize. Not that it was a bad smile. It was warm enough, and his arms were full 2 paper bags from the grocery store on Burnside, the one Frank and I had shopped at for years, the one that still put your receipt in the bag instead of handing it to you separately, which Frank always said was the mark of a store that understood how people actually lived. Ryan set the bags on the counter, started unloading without being asked, and talked about the weather and the drive over and whether I had been eating enough. I told him I had been eating fine. He nodded like he wasn't entirely sure he believed me, but he let it go. That was how those first weeks felt, like being held very gently by someone who was careful not to squeeze too hard. Ryan came by often, sometimes every other day. He fixed the loose hinge on the back gate that Frank had been meaning to get to. He drove me to a follow-up appointment with my doctor when my car was in the shop, waited in the lobby with a cup of coffee and a magazine, didn't make a production of it. He called in the evenings, not for long, just to check in, the way you call someone when you want them to know they haven't been forgotten. I won't pretend it wasn't a comfort. The house had grown very quiet in ways I hadn't anticipated. Frank was a calm man, not loud, not someone who filled a room with noise, but his presence had its own weight, its own texture. When he was there, the house felt inhabited in a particular way. After he was gone, even the rooms I spent the most time in felt slightly different, like furniture that had been moved an inch in every direction, technically the same arrangement, but nothing quite where your hands expected it to be. So yes, Ryan's visits helped. I was grateful for them, and I told him so. Diane came along sometimes, Ryan's wife of 14 years, a woman with a sharp eye for detail and the kind of efficient energy that expresses itself through rearranging things. She brought food, 2 casseroles, mostly the kind that freeze well and reheat without much effort. She was pleasant in the careful way that people are pleasant when they are making an effort, and I appreciated the effort even if I sometimes found her attention a little more focused than the situation seemed to require. The first time I noticed something shifting, it wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. Ryan started reminding me to take my medications. At first, it was a passing comment: had I taken my blood pressure pill? Did I need him to pick up a refill? I told him I had a system that had been working perfectly well for years, a small weekly organizer on the bathroom shelf that Frank had given me as a joke one birthday, and that I had used faithfully ever since. Ryan nodded, said of course, said he just wanted to make sure. A week later, he brought over a new organizer, larger, with the days printed in bigger letters and individual compartments for morning and evening doses. He set it on the counter with the same matter-of-fact manner he brought the groceries. He didn't ask if I wanted it. I used my old one. Then came the bills. Ryan offered to help organize the household accounts, just temporarily, while I was still getting settled into the new routines. He said the estate paperwork had left things complicated, and he wanted to make sure nothing was missed. I told him I had been managing household finances since before he was born, that I had built a career doing exactly that on a far larger scale. He said he knew. He just wanted to help. I let him look things over once. He came back the next week with a folder. The afternoon Diane rearranged the kitchen was a Tuesday in January. I had been resting upstairs, something I did more often in those months than I had in most of my adult life, not from illness but from the particular exhaustion of grief, which is less like being tired and more like being slightly removed from yourself. When I came downstairs, she was closing the last cabinet. The plates were in a different cupboard. The spices had been moved to a rack above the stove. The utensils were in the drawer to the right of the sink instead of the left, where they had lived for more than 20 years. She turned and saw me looking. "I thought this layout would be easier for you," she said, with a smile that expected to be thanked. I looked at the cabinets for a moment. Then I looked at her. "I knew where everything was," I said. Diane's smile didn't falter. "You'll get used to it," she said. "It's a better system." I didn't say anything else. I opened the drawer to the right and took out a spoon and made myself a cup of tea, and I stood at the counter and drank it slowly while she gathered her things. A better system. I turned the phrase over in my mind long after she was gone. The keys came up about a month after that. Ryan mentioned casually during one of his evening visits that maybe it would be a good idea if he held onto my car keys for a while, just as a precaution. Given everything, I told him no, politely but without any room for interpretation. He paused for just a moment, and in that pause I saw something that had nothing to do with the concern he was describing. His jaw tightened barely, quickly, the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Then the smile came back, easy and warm, and he said of course, that he understood, that he just wanted to make sure I was safe. He dropped the subject and left 20 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. The rain was coming down again, steady and gray, the way it does in Portland in February when winter has settled in and decided to stay. I thought about that half second, that jaw, that smile returning just a beat too late, and I filed it away. I had been reading financial statements since before Ryan was born. You don't spend 35 years with numbers without learning that they always tell the truth eventually. People lie. Circumstances shift. Memories reshape themselves around what we want to believe. But numbers, entered correctly and followed carefully, do none of those things. They sit on the page exactly as they are, waiting for someone to pay attention long enough to hear what they're saying. That Tuesday morning in March, I drove myself to the Callahan & Sons office on the east side of Portland, the same building Frank had moved the company into 18 years ago, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and the faint, permanent smell of sawdust that no amount of renovation had ever fully removed. I hadn't been back since the holidays. I went that morning for no particular reason beyond the fact that I missed it. The people, the familiar rhythm of a working office, the sense of being somewhere that had mattered to me for most of my adult life. Dorothy, who had managed the front desk since the late 90s and brought homemade banana bread to every company birthday without exception, wrapped both arms around me the moment I walked through the door. Pete, a senior project manager who had worked alongside Frank for over 2 decades, came out of his office with his reading glasses still pushed up on his head and shook my hand with both of his. There were others too, familiar faces, warm greetings, the particular comfort of being known by people who remembered you before everything changed. Ryan was not in. Dorothy mentioned he had a site visit that morning, said it with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure how much to share. I stayed about an hour, had coffee in the break room, let Dorothy catch me up on the usual news, a new contract in Beaverton, a retirement party coming up for one of the foremen, the ongoing debate about replacing the coffee maker that had been barely functioning since the previous year. Ordinary things, the texture of a place still moving forward. Before I left, I stopped by the accounting office. The door was open, the way it always used to be when I worked there, and I walked in without thinking much about it, the way you move through spaces your body knows by memory. The man sitting at what had been my desk for nearly 3 decades was someone I didn't recognize. Young, mid-20s, with the slightly startled look of someone not expecting company. Dorothy had mentioned a new hire in accounting, someone Ryan had brought on about 4 months ago. His name was Brandon, and he stood when I entered with the uncertain politeness of someone unsure of the protocol. I introduced myself. His expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes, quickly smoothed over. He knew exactly who I was. I told him I was just passing through, that I only wanted to see the old space. He relaxed slightly. I asked if the quarterly reports were still filed the same way, the green binders on the second shelf, the system I had put in place in 2003 that Frank had insisted no one touch because it worked. Brandon nodded and gestured toward the shelf. I pulled the most recent binder and flipped through it at the standing table by the window, not looking for anything specific, just looking, the way you do when your hands know their work even before your mind forms a clear intention. Revenue figures were where I expected them. Project costs within normal range. Equipment depreciation, insurance premiums, subcontractor payments, all formatted the way I had always formatted them. Then I reached the benefits section. The retirement fund contributions were listed, as they should be, on the 3rd page. Callahan & Sons had maintained a defined contribution plan for full-time employees since 1991, one of the things Frank had been most particular about. He believed a company owed its workers something lasting, something they could count on beyond the weekly paycheck. I looked at the contribution column, then at the disbursement column beside it. The disbursements were wrong. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious it would catch an untrained eye. The amounts were small, 2,000 here, 3,500 there, scattered across different line items, categorized under administrative overhead in a way that would seem unremarkable unless you knew exactly how this fund had always been structured. I turned back 2 quarters. The same pattern. Another quarterback still there, slightly smaller but consistent, regular, deliberate. I closed the binder and returned it to the shelf without changing my expression. Then I turned to Brandon, who had been watching me from his desk with the careful stillness of someone trying very hard to appear unconcerned. "The administrative overhead in the benefits section runs higher than I remember," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Is there a supplementary report that accounts for that?" He glanced at his screen, then back at me. "I'd have to check with Ryan on the specifics," he said. "He handles the benefits accounting directly now." "Does he?" I said. "That's a change from how we used to run things." "It's just how he set it up," Brandon said. The smoothed-over expression again. The half-second pause that said more than the words did. I thanked him, said goodbye to Dorothy on my way out, told her the banana bread had been wonderful. I kept my pace steady all the way to my car. It was only once I was behind the wheel, door closed, engine off, that I let myself do the math properly. Quarter by quarter, entry by entry. The way Frank and I used to work through figures together at the kitchen table after dinner. The pattern held every time. The amounts were small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags, but applied consistently across 3 full years. $400,000, give or take. I sat with that number for a long moment. Outside, the bare March trees at the edge of the parking lot moved slightly in the wind. The Portland sky above them was the flat white of early spring, not quite gray, not quite bright, the kind of light that doesn't commit to anything. I had found discrepancies before, in my years doing this work. Errors happened, misclassifications, vendor disputes, honest mistakes that muddied the books for a quarter before being corrected. I knew the difference between a mistake and a pattern. This was a pattern. I didn't yet understand everything it meant. I couldn't yet see the full shape of what I was looking at. But 35 years had taught me one thing above everything else: when numbers tell you something is wrong, you listen, even when part of you would rather not know the answer. The thing about lies is that they work best when they're built on something true. I had been forgetful lately. Anyone who had just lost their husband of 44 years would be. I misplaced my reading glasses twice in 1 week. I left the back door unlocked overnight on a Tuesday, something I discovered only when I went to let in the morning air and found it already open. I stood in the cereal aisle at the grocery store for a full minute once, completely unable to remember whether I preferred the brand on the left or the one on the right, before I realized I had been buying the same cereal since 1987, and the problem wasn't memory, it was exhaustion. Grief does that. It doesn't announce itself as confusion. It just quietly borrows your attention without asking, leaves you slightly less present in the small moments, the kind that don't matter much on their own but start to add up if someone is keeping track. Ryan was keeping track. He brought it up on a Wednesday morning in April, about 3 weeks after my visit to the office. He stopped by with coffee the good kind from the place on Division Street that Frank used to like, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the particular expression he had been wearing more often lately. Concerned, careful, slightly pained, the way you look when you're about to say something you've been rehearsing. He said he had been thinking. He said he had noticed some things that worried him. He mentioned the back door. He mentioned the reading glasses. He brought up a phone call from 2 weeks prior in which he said I had repeated myself twice without seeming to realize it, something I did not remember doing and did not believe had happened the way he described it. He thought it might be a good idea to see someone, just to check. A routine visit, nothing alarming, just to have a baseline. I told him I already had a doctor. He said he'd already made the appointment. Dr. Patricia Harmon had been my primary care physician for 11 years, a practical, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s who ran her practice out of a small clinic in the Eastmoreland neighborhood, and who I had always trusted precisely because she said exactly what she meant and nothing more. I had been a reliable patient, annual checkups, consistent follow-through on anything she recommended, no dramatic health events to speak of beyond the blood pressure medication I had been managing without incident for going on 8 years. When Ryan and I arrived that morning, he walked slightly ahead of me through the door, the way he had begun doing in recent weeks, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to directly, just enough to establish, without saying anything, that he was the one managing the situation. Dr. Harmon came in after a few minutes, greeted us both, asked how I had been doing since Frank's passing. She was warm in her usual direct way. I told her I was managing. Ryan told her I had been struggling more than I let on. I looked at him. He didn't look back at me. He kept his eyes on the doctor with the focused, earnest expression of a man delivering information he found difficult but necessary. He described the back door, the reading glasses, the repeated phone call. He added things I hadn't heard before, a conversation he said I'd forgotten, having a bill he claimed I had paid twice, a dinner last month where he said I had seemed confused about what day it was. Each item delivered in the same measured, sorrowful tone. Each one just plausible enough to land, without being specific enough to challenge easily. I let him finish. Dr. Harmon was writing something on her notepad. When Ryan paused, she looked up and turned to me. "Margaret," she said, using my full name the way she always did, "how have you been feeling?" "In your own words." And that was when I stopped being quiet. "I'd like to address what was just said," I told her, keeping my voice even. The back door was left unlocked once, in 8 months of living alone for the first time in my adult life, while managing an estate, a household, and the kind of grief that doesn't follow a schedule. The reading glasses were on the bathroom shelf both times, and I don't have any recollection of repeating myself on that phone call, which is not the same thing as it not happening, but it is worth noting that I have not had a single cognitive concern flagged by any medical professional in my life. Ryan started to speak. I continued. "I spent 35 years catching errors that other people made and missed. I balanced accounts that other people couldn't reconcile. I have not lost that capacity. What I have lost is my husband, and I think it's worth being precise about which one of those things is actually happening here." The room was quiet for a moment. Dr. Harmon looked at me with an expression I recognized the careful assessment of a clinician recalibrating. She asked me several standard orientation questions. The date, the current season, the name of the sitting president, a short-term recall exercise involving 3 unrelated words. I answered every one without hesitation. She noted my responses. She did not offer a diagnosis. She said she thought it was reasonable to schedule a follow-up in 3 months, that grief could sometimes present in ways that resembled cognitive difficulty, and that a baseline assessment was never a bad idea regardless of circumstances. She said this to both of us, equally, without leaning in either direction. It was as fair as I could have hoped for, but I noticed that Ryan was already framing his response before she finished speaking, nodding slowly, as if she had confirmed something rather than deferred it. We drove home on the Burnside Bridge, the Willamette gray and wide below us, the West Hills just visible through the low cloud. Ryan had the radio on at a volume that made conversation technically possible but practically awkward. I didn't try. Neither did he. At one point, somewhere on the bridge, I glanced over at him. His hands were relaxed on the wheel. His jaw was set. He was looking straight ahead with the focused stillness of someone who has just encountered an obstacle they hadn't fully planned for and is already deciding what to do about it. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He just drove. And somehow, that silence worried me more than anything he could have said. I have always believed that you learn more about a person in the moments they think no one is listening. Not because people are necessarily dishonest when they know they have an audience. Most of us manage ourselves reasonably well in public. We choose our words, moderate our tone, present the version of ourselves we've decided is appropriate for the situation. But in private, in the unguarded moments between one performance and the next, something else comes through. Something truer. Frank used to say the same thing about job sites. He could tell more about a contractor's character in 5 minutes of watching them work alone than in an hour of sitting across a table from them. The way a person behaves when they believe the outcome is already settled, when they think no one who matters is paying attention that tells you everything. It was a Thursday evening in late April, 4 days after the appointment with Dr. Harmon. Ryan had come over after work, which had become a near-daily occurrence. He and Diane, both she arrived about 20 minutes after he did, carrying a container of soup she said she'd made extra of, setting it in the refrigerator with the practiced ease of someone who had decided the kitchen was already partially hers. I had been upstairs since around 7, reading in the chair by the window in what used to be Frank's study. Not because I was tired, but because I had been finding, increasingly, that I thought more clearly with some distance between myself and whatever was happening on the ground floor. The house had a particular acoustics, something about the open layout Frank had insisted on when they renovated in 2001, the way sound traveled up the stairwell and along the upstairs hall without much interference. I wasn't trying to overhear anything. I want to be clear about that. I had simply gotten up to get a glass of water from the bathroom down the hall, and their voices were already there when I stepped into the corridor, rising naturally through the open space below. Ryan was speaking in the tone he used when he thought he was being careful, lower than his normal register, deliberate, but not quite quiet enough for a house that had always carried sound the way ours did. "She went to the office," he said. A pause. Then Diane's voice, sharper, more compressed. "When?" "A few weeks ago," Brandon told me. Another pause. Longer. She was looking at the books. I stood very still in the hallway. The floorboard beneath my left foot had a slight give to it. I had known that for 20 years, had always stepped around it without thinking. I stepped around it now. "How much did she see?" Diane asked. "Enough." Ryan's voice was flat. The warmth he used with me, the careful concern, the practiced softness, none of it was present. What remained without those things was something I had not heard from him before, something stripped down and deliberate. "She's already seen too much. I don't know exactly what she put together, but she's not going to let it go. You know how she is." Diane said something I couldn't fully make out. A low question, the specific words blurred by distance. Ryan answered clearly enough. "The doctor didn't give us what we needed." She pushed back in there. "You should have heard her." A short pause. "That can't happen again. Next time there can't be room for her to push back." The soup container clicked softly against a shelf as Diane moved something in the refrigerator. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular quality it got when she was working through a problem rather than reacting to one measured, practical, already a step ahead. "What if she talks to someone before then?" she asked. "A lawyer, or one of those people from the office who still check on her." Ryan didn't answer immediately. I heard the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor, the sound of him sitting down. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but the house carried it just the same. "That's why we need to move fast," he said, "before she has the chance." I did not move for a long moment. The hallway was dark, except for the thin line of light under the bathroom door at the far end. Outside, Portland was doing what it does in late April. A light rain had started at some point in the evening, steady and unremarkable, the kind that arrives without announcement and settles in for the night. I could hear it faintly against the window at the end of the hall. Downstairs, Ryan and Diane had moved on to something else. The register of their voices had shifted lighter, more domestic, the ordinary sounds of two people tidying up a kitchen. As if the previous conversation had been nothing more than a brief pause in the regular order of the evening, I stood in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about the numbers I had seen in that binder. The small amounts, the consistent pattern, the 3 years of careful, incremental entries that added up to something no one was supposed to notice. I thought about Brandon's expression when I asked about the supplementary report. I thought about Ryan's face on the drive home from Dr. Harmon's office, the set jaw, the forward gaze, the quality of a man recalculating. The two things I had been holding separately in my mind, what I had seen in the office, what had been happening at home, had just been placed in the same sentence by my son himself, in a voice he had never intended me to hear. I had spent 35 years making sure numbers told the truth. Now I understood my son was terrified of exactly that. I had spent 35 years building records that held companies accountable. That night, I was going to use everything I knew to hold my own son accountable. I waited until the house was completely quiet. Ryan and Diane had left around 9 dishes rinsed, goodnight said at the door, headlights sweeping across the front window before disappearing into the wet Portland night. I sat at the kitchen table until the clock read 10:45. Then I got to work. I started with what I carried in my memory from the office visit. Reconstructing figures in sequence was a skill I had never lost, holding a column of numbers the way other people hold a conversation, detail by detail, in the order they appeared. Frank used to call it my card trick. I called it doing my job. I wrote in pencil on the backs of old envelopes from the kitchen drawer, the kind of paper no one looks at twice. Quarter by quarter, I rebuilt what I had seen, the contribution amounts, the disbursement figures. The administrative overhead categories that didn't match how the retirement fund had always been structured. 3 years of small, consistent, deliberate misdirection, reconstructed as accurately as memory allowed. The pattern held exactly as I remembered it. When I was satisfied, I folded the envelopes and tucked them into the inside pocket of my heavy charcoal winter coat, the one I rarely wore anymore, hanging in the back of the hall closet. Not hidden dramatically, just placed somewhere that required specific intention to find. The second part of what I needed required leaving the house. Carol Briggs had lived next door for 16 years, a retired school teacher with a herb garden and a landline telephone she used without apology. We had the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance. Several evenings earlier, when the walls of my own house had begun to feel less like shelter and more like something I couldn't name, I had knocked on her door and asked to use her phone. I told her mine was having difficulties, which was true enough. Ryan had recently taken over managing my cellular account, and I had agreed before thinking carefully about what agreeing meant. Carol handed me the phone and went to the kitchen without asking questions. That was Carol precisely. Martin Webb had been the Callahan family attorney for 22 years, incorporation of the company, property purchases, Frank's estate, every significant document our family had produced across 2 decades. Semi-retired now, working from a small office in Lake Oswego. More importantly, he was a man who had known Frank personally, and who understood, without needing it explained, exactly what kind of people we were. He answered on the 3rd ring. Past 11, which surprised me. I apologized for the hour. He said not to worry and asked what was going on. I told him the pattern in the retirement fund accounts, the figures I had reconstructed, the 3-year timeline, the appointment with Dr. Harmon, and what Ryan had said before I could speak for myself. The conversation I had overheard 2 evenings earlier. Martin listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause, not hesitation, but the quiet of someone organizing what they've heard into the shape it actually is. Write down everything you just told me, he said. Dates, figures, exact wording where you can. Keep it somewhere Ryan wouldn't think to look. He paused. Can you call me again in a few days from this number? I said I could. We agreed on a time. Back at Carol's kitchen table, she handed me a mug of tea and didn't push for details. We sat for a few minutes without talking much, and that was exactly what I needed. Home again, I sat at my kitchen table past midnight with a single sheet of notepaper and a pen. The house was quiet in the way it gets at that hour, every small sound carrying further than it should. I thought carefully about what to write. Not the financial records, those were already handled. Something different, smaller, and in its own way more important. What I was about to put on paper meant acknowledging, fully and without softening it, that the situation had moved past the point where patience and ordinary family expectations were going to be enough. I wrote 9 words. I am not confused. I am not safe. Please help. I looked at them for a moment. Then I folded the paper into a tight, flat rectangle, small enough to be invisible, large enough to be found. My winter coat hung on the chair beside me. I had noticed weeks ago that the lining had begun to separate from the shell along the left inner seam, one of those small household repairs that accumulates on a list and never quite gets done. I took the small sewing kit from the kitchen drawer, the one that had lived there since the early years of our marriage, and threaded a needle. I opened the separation just enough to slide the folded paper through. Then I closed it again with small, even stitches the way my mother had taught me when I was 9. When I finished, I pressed my fingers lightly along the seam. Nothing visible, nothing that shifted when the coat moved. Just a coat, looking exactly like what it was supposed to be. I went upstairs and stood for a moment in front of the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was tired in the particular way that comes from clarity, from seeing something fully and understanding exactly what it means, without any room left for the comfort of uncertainty. Frank always said I was the one who kept the books honest. I turned off the light and went to bed. He said it was a specialist. 40 minutes outside Portland, someone who could help with memory concerns. He said it the way you say something you've practiced, not stiff, not rehearsed in any obvious way, but with the particular smoothness of a sentence that has been turned over enough times to lose its edges. He was standing in my kitchen at 7:50 in the morning, already in his jacket, keys in hand, coffee untouched on the counter. I had been up since 6, That was not unusual for me. I had never been a late sleeper, and the years since Frank's passing had made mornings earlier still, the way grief tends to push you toward wakefulness before the day has given you any reason to face it. I was dressed when Ryan knocked. I opened the door, and he came in with the energy of someone who had already decided how the morning was going to go. He said the appointment was at 9:15. He said the drive would take about 40 minutes depending on traffic. He said I should bring a light jacket because these offices were sometimes cold. I asked for the name of the specialist. He said it was a referral, someone Dr. Harmon's office had recommended, that the name wouldn't mean anything to me. He said it in a tone that suggested the question itself was slightly beside the point. I asked for the address. He said he had it in his phone and not to worry about it. I went and got my coat. Not a light jacket, my heavy charcoal winter coat, the one from the hall closet, the one I had worn through enough Oregon winters to know exactly how it fit. I put it on in the entryway while Ryan waited by the door, and I did not explain the choice. He glanced at it once, then looked away. Diane was already in the car, passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap. She turned when I got in and offered the same composed smile she had been offering for months, the one that arrived a half second after eye contact, the kind that is assembled rather than felt. She asked if I had slept well. I said I had. She said that was good and turned back toward the windshield. Ryan pulled out of the driveway without ceremony. I watched the streets. This was something I had always done on drives, a habit from decades of early morning commutes across Portland, the particular attention of someone who had learned to know a city by its intersections rather than its landmarks. I knew the East Side grid, the way I knew the retirement fund accounts, not by memorization exactly, but by familiarity deep enough that anything out of pattern registered without effort. We took Burnside east, which made sense. Then a turn onto Cesar Chavez that made slightly less sense, given the direction Ryan had implied. Then onto a connector road I recognized as heading southeast rather than toward any of the medical or professional districts I knew. I watched the mile markers and the exit signs and noted each one without comment. The neighborhoods changed as we drove. The familiar east side streets gave way to stretches I knew less well, then to areas I recognized only in the general sense, light industrial corridors, stretches of commercial real estate with lower signage and more parking, the kind of geography that exists at the edges of cities, functional and unadorned. Ryan drove without music. Diane kept her eyes forward. The silence between the three of us had the dense quality of a room where everything important had already been decided. Around the 30-minute mark, I asked again where we were going. Ryan said we were almost there. Diane shifted slightly in her seat, a small movement, barely perceptible, the kind you make when you are waiting for something to be over. I looked out the window and counted the cross streets. We turned onto a road I didn't know, running alongside a low stretch of commercial buildings, some occupied, some not. The landscaping along the road was minimal, a few planted strips, some ornamental grasses flattened by the previous night's rain. The sky above it was the flat, pale white of an Oregon morning that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to clear. At the end of the road, a building came into view. Single story, running long and low across its lot. Faded paint on the exterior, the particular weathered beige of a structure that had been maintained just enough to remain functional and no more. Narrow windows spaced at regular intervals along the front facade. A small parking area with a handful of vehicles, none of them new. And a sign mounted beside the entrance in the kind of lettering that had once been professional and was now just legible. I read it once, then I read it again. I had seen that name before. In something Ryan had left on the kitchen counter 3 weeks ago, something he thought I hadn't noticed. The smell hit me first. Bleach and something older underneath it, the particular quiet of a place where people had stopped expecting things to get better. I had stepped through enough thresholds in my life to know that some of them change you in the crossing. The moment I walked through that front door, I felt it not panic, not the dramatic recognition you might expect, but something quieter and more absolute. The understanding that the ordinary rules of the outside world did not fully apply in here, and that the people who had brought me through that door were counting on exactly that. The reception area was small and overlit, the fluorescent fixtures casting the particular flat brightness that flattens everything beneath it faces, colors, the distinction between one person's expression and another's. A long counter ran along the far wall, behind which a woman in scrubs sat at a computer without looking up when we entered. Chairs lined 2 of the walls, the kind upholstered in a faded pattern that might have been cheerful once. A laminated sign near the door listed visiting hours. Another listed facility rules, the text small enough that you would have to stand directly in front of it to read it. 2 people sat in the waiting area. An older man near the window turned slightly toward the glass, watching something in the middle distance that the rest of us couldn't see. A woman across from him, hands in her lap, her gaze moving slowly around the room without settling on anything. Neither of them acknowledged our arrival. Ryan walked to the counter with the ease of someone who had been here before, or had at least rehearsed the approach. He gave my name. He gave his own as next of kin. He slid a folder across the counter documents I hadn't seen him carrying when we left the house, which meant he had brought them from the car deliberately, which meant this had been arranged long before this morning. The woman at the counter took the folder without comment and began entering information into her computer. "She'll need to complete intake," she said, to Ryan rather than to me. "Of course," Ryan said. "We're ready." I spoke then. "I haven't agreed to anything yet." The woman glanced up briefly, then looked at Ryan. "She gets a little confused about appointments," he said, his voice shifting into the particular register he used, warm, slightly pained, the tone of a devoted son managing a difficult situation with grace. "It's part of why we're here." I kept my voice level. "I am not confused. I was not told where we were coming, and I was not told what kind of appointment this was." The woman looked between us once more. Then she returned to her screen. That was when I understood something about this place that I had only suspected from the outside. It was not structured around the question of what the people inside it wanted. It was structured around the paperwork that arrived with them. We were directed to a seating area to wait for the intake coordinator. Ryan sat beside me, close enough that the gesture read as attentive. Diane took the chair to my right, completing the arrangement. The 3 of us sat in a row in the overlit room, while the man by the window went on watching whatever he was watching, and the clock on the wall moved with the particular indifference of institutional clocks. A staff member appeared after several minutes and led us to a small room down the hall. The room held a desk, 4 chairs, and a narrow window with a view of the side parking lot. The staff member, a middle-aged man who introduced himself as the intake coordinator, opened a clipboard and began working through a standard set of questions. He directed them at Ryan. "Her current medications?" Ryan provided the list. Several of the items he named were not medications I took. I said so clearly. Ryan said I sometimes forgot which prescriptions were current. "Her primary care physician?" Ryan gave Dr. Harmon's name and contact information, which was accurate. I noted that he had it memorized. "Any recent incidents, falls? Disorientation? Episodes of confusion?" Ryan described 3. None of them had happened the way he said. I corrected each one. The intake coordinator noted my corrections with a nod that suggested he was noting Ryan's version as the baseline and mine as a symptom. I had been in enough professional settings to recognize when a process had already decided its outcome. This room, this clipboard, this careful choreography, none of it was designed to assess me. It was designed to document me. There was a difference, and I felt it with the same clarity I felt bad numbers in a ledger. I was considering how to respond to the next question when the door opened. She was younger than anyone else I had seen in the building, late 20s, perhaps 30, with the alert, unhurried bearing of someone who had not yet learned to stop paying attention. Her name badge identified her as Rosa and her role as nursing staff. She came in to deliver something to the intake coordinator, a brief exchange of paperwork, the kind of routine errand that happens a dozen times a day in any medical setting. But as she turned to leave, she paused. She looked at me, not at Ryan, not at the clipboard, not at the folder on the desk, at me. Directly, fully, in the way that people look at other people when they have not yet decided what they're seeing and intend to find out. Most people who had looked at me since we walked through that door had been looking at the version of me that Ryan's paperwork described. Rosa had not read the paperwork yet. She asked the intake coordinator a brief question about scheduling, listened to his answer, and then in the same unhurried way she had done everything else, she turned back to me. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, her voice clear and without performance, "are you here by choice?" There are moments that last only a few seconds but carry the weight of everything that came before them. I had lived long enough to know a few of them by heart. The moment Frank got down on one knee in his mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in 1980, holding a ring he had saved for 11 months to buy. The moment the doctor used the word malignant in a sentence with Frank's name in it, The moment I stood at the back of a church in April 2 years ago and understood, in the particular physical way that grief announces itself, that the person I had built my life around was no longer in it. I knew those moments. I recognized their weight. What happened in that small room with Rosa was one of them. She had asked the intake coordinator a brief question after her question to me, spoken in a low voice I couldn't fully hear. Whatever she said resulted in him standing up, excusing himself, and stepping out of the room. Rosa stayed. She looked at Ryan and said, with the polite finality of someone who was not actually offering a choice, that she needed to complete a standard nursing assessment with me privately and that it would take about 15 minutes. Ryan started to say something. Rosa said it was standard procedure, said it in exactly the tone that closes a conversation rather than continuing it, and held the door. He and Diane went into the hallway. The door closed behind them. The room felt different with just the two of us in it. Smaller in terms of square footage, but larger in every other sense, as if the air itself had more room to move. Rosa pulled her chair around to my side of the desk rather than sitting across from it, which was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. She had a notepad. She set it on her knee without opening it. "I'm going to ask you some questions," she said. "Standard orientation assessment. But first, is there anything you want to tell me?" I looked at her for a moment. She had the steady, unhurried quality of someone who had learned to create stillness around herself, the kind of person who makes space for other people to fill. In 30 years of professional life, I had worked with a handful of people like that, and I had always trusted them more than the ones who rushed to fill every silence. I reached into the left inner pocket of my coat. My fingers found the seam immediately, the small, careful stitching I had placed the night before, the slight firmness of the folded paper beneath. I worked the stitches open with my thumbnail, slowly enough not to tear the fabric, and drew out the folded rectangle. I held it out to her. She took it without hesitation, unfolded it carefully. The way you handle something when you understand it matters. Read it once, then read it again, more slowly. 9 words. "I am not confused. I am not safe. Please help." She looked up at me. "Tell me," she said simply. And so I did. Not everything, there wasn't time for everything, and I had learned enough in the past months to know which details carried the most weight in a short window. I told her I had not been informed of where we were going this morning. I told her the medications Ryan had listed were not medications I took. I told her the incidents he had described to the intake coordinator had been misrepresented. I told her that I had contacted an attorney, that there were financial irregularities at the family company that I had documented, and that I believed my son's motivation for placing me here was connected to those irregularities rather than to any genuine concern for my well-being. I spoke clearly. I spoke in sequence. I did not rush and I did not ramble. When I finished, Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she began the orientation assessment. She had mentioned date, year, current season, the name of the sitting president, a short recall exercise. With 3 unrelated words, she asked me to repeat back 5 minutes after giving them to me. I answered every question correctly and without hesitation. She noted each answer on her pad. Then she set the pad down and looked at me with the direct, settled attention of someone who has just made a decision. "I believe you," she said. 3 words. I had been managing, for the better part of 8 months, with the particular careful composure of someone who understands that falling apart is a luxury they cannot afford. I had watched Ryan take my keys and reorganize my finances and stand in a doctor's office and describe a woman I didn't recognize. I had stood in a dark hallway and listened to my son discuss the best way to ensure I couldn't speak for myself. I had sewn a piece of paper into the lining of a coat and gone to bed and gotten up the next morning and gotten into a car without letting any of it show on my face. I had done all of that. And then Rosa said those 3 words, and something in me that had been held at a specific tension for a very long time simply released. I didn't cry dramatically. I wasn't raised for dramatic crying, and 72 years hadn't changed that. But my eyes filled, and I let them, and for a moment I didn't arrange my expression into anything at all. I just sat in that chair in that small room and felt the full weight of what it meant to be believed by someone who had no reason to believe me except that she had listened carefully and the evidence was clear. It is a strange thing to realize how much of your energy has been spent simply trying to be seen accurately, not heroically, not sympathetically, just accurately, as the person you actually are, with the faculties you actually have, in the situation you are actually in. I had been spending that energy for months without fully accounting for the cost of it, and in the moment Rosa said those words, I felt exactly how much it had taken. She waited. She didn't fill the silence or redirect the moment or do any of the things that people sometimes do when other people's emotions make them uncomfortable. She just sat with me in it, with the patience of someone who understood that this particular moment needed to be allowed to exist. After a while, I straightened in my chair. I took a slow breath. I looked at her. What happens now? I asked. She picked up her notepad. Her expression was calm and certain in the way that people are certain when they know exactly what the right thing to do is and have already decided to do it. I'm going to make some calls, she said. Outside the door, I could hear Ryan's voice, still calm, still controlled, still certain that everything was going according to plan. I have always believed in systems, accounting systems, legal systems, systems of checks and balances. That afternoon, I was grateful those systems still worked. I don't know exactly how much time passed while I sat in that small room after Rosa left. The clock on the wall read a few minutes past 10 when she stepped out. By the time the door opened again, it was closer to 11. I had spent that hour the way I had learned to spend uncertain stretches of time in recent months, quietly, attentively, without spending energy on outcomes I couldn't yet influence. Rosa came back once, briefly, to tell me that some people were on their way and that I should stay where I was. She said it with the same calm certainty she brought to everything, and I nodded and she left again. Through the wall, I could hear the muffled register of Ryan's voice in the hallway, the warm, measured tone he used when he was managing a situation, rising and falling at intervals that suggested he was doing most of the talking. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The two officers who arrived were from the county sheriff's department, a man and a woman, both in uniform, both carrying themselves with the particular, unhurried professionalism of people who had learned that most situations respond better to steadiness than to urgency. They were accompanied by a woman in plain clothes who introduced herself as a field investigator with Adult Protective Services, a state agency responsible for looking into concerns involving the welfare of older adults. Her name was Karen Delgado, and she had a canvas bag over one shoulder and the attentive, evaluating expression of someone who had seen many versions of this kind of situation and was already taking stock of this. I heard them arrive before I saw them, the change in Ryan's voice through the wall, the shift from managed warmth to something with more effort in it. Officer Delgado, no relation to the APS investigator, knocked on the door of my room and introduced herself and her partner, Officer Tran. They asked if they could come in. I said yes. They pulled two chairs around and sat at the same level as me, which I noted and appreciated. Officer Tran had a notepad. Officer Delgado did the talking. She asked me to confirm my name, my address, and my date of birth. I did. She asked me to describe, in my own words, what had happened that morning. I did that too clearly, in sequence, without editorializing. I told her I had not been informed of our destination. I told her the intake documents contained medications I had never been prescribed. I told her the incidents Ryan had described to the intake coordinator were either fabricated or substantially misrepresented. I told her I had contacted a family attorney several days earlier and that he had been made aware of the situation. Officer Tran wrote steadily throughout. Officer Delgado listened without interrupting, which I had learned was rarer than it should be. When I finished, she asked me the same orientation questions Rosa had asked earlier. I answered them the same way correctly, without hesitation, without effort. She thanked me and said she needed to speak with the other parties. She asked me to remain available. I said I wasn't going anywhere. What happened in the hallway over the next 40 minutes, I know partly from what I could hear and partly from what Karen Delgado described to me afterward. The intake documents Rosa had flagged were reviewed against my actual medical records, which the officers were able to access through Dr. Harmon's office with a release I provided on the spot. The discrepancies were immediate and significant, not only the medication list, but dates, incident descriptions, and a physician referral letter that, on closer examination, did not match the formatting or contact information of any practice associated with Dr. Harmon's office. Ryan had been calm at first. He was good at calm. I had watched him practice it for 2 years. He explained that I was confused, that I had a history of misremembering conversations, that the documents had been prepared in good faith based on his observations as my primary caregiver. He used the word caregiver with the ease of someone who had been using it long enough for it to feel accurate. But the officers asked specific questions. They asked for the name and contact information of the physician who had issued the referral letter. Ryan provided a name. The name did not match the letter. They asked when he had last spoken to Dr. Harmon directly. His answer did not align with the records. They asked about the medication list, which pharmacy, which prescribing physician, how long each medication had been in use. The answers came more slowly now, and they did not hold together the way answers hold together when they are true. Diane said very little. I had noticed, over the months, that Diane was most dangerous when she was most quiet, but in this particular room, with these particular people asking these particular questions, her silence was working against the story, rather than for it. Karen Delgado came back to speak with me midway through. She sat across from me with her canvas bag on her knee and asked me, in a straightforward way, whether I had anyone I could contact, family, a close friend, an attorney. I told her about Martin Webb. She asked if I could reach him. I said I could, and she handed me her own phone without hesitation. Martin answered on the second ring. I told him where I was and what was happening. He said he would be there within the hour. His voice had the same unhurried quality it always had, which settled something in me more than any reassurance could have. When I came back into the hallway, Ryan was standing near the far wall with his arms crossed loosely, the posture of a man maintaining composure by keeping very still. Diane stood beside him, her own arms folded, her gaze directed at a fixed point on the floor. The two officers stood between us, their positioning neither aggressive nor accidental. One of the officers, Officer Tran, turned to Ryan and said, in the measured tone of someone delivering information rather than a verdict, that he and his wife would need to remain at the facility to answer some additional questions, that the intake documentation had raised concerns that required clarification, that this would likely take some time. Ryan's arms tightened slightly across his chest. His jaw moved in a way I recognized. Then he turned and looked at me. It was the first time since we had arrived that morning that he had looked at me directly, not past me, not through me, not at the version of me his documents described. At me, the actual person standing in the hallway in a charcoal winter coat who had spent the last 2 years watching and waiting and writing things down and sewing small pieces of paper into coat linings while he made his plans. For the first time in 2 years, I did not look away. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from looking at your child and no longer recognizing them. Not the pain of loss, exactly, though loss is part of it. Not anger, though anger has its place in it too. It is something more specific than either of those things. It is the pain of revision, of having to go back through years of accumulated memory and understand that certain things you took as true were built on a foundation that did not hold the weight you placed on it. That the person you thought you knew was always, in some important way, someone you were still in the process of inventing. I had been doing that revision quietly, in pieces, for the better part of 2 years. But standing in the hallway of that building with the afternoon light coming gray and flat through the narrow windows, I felt the full weight of it settle in a way it hadn't before. Martin arrived at 12:30, as he had said he would. He came through the front entrance with his briefcase and the expression of a man who had assessed the situation from the parking lot and arrived with his conclusions already formed. He shook my hand with both of his, the way he always had, asked if I was all right, and when I said I was managing, he nodded in the way that meant he believed me and we could proceed. He spent 40 minutes in a separate room with Officer Tran and Karen Delgado, the APS investigator. I sat in the reception area and watched the flat light move across the floor and thought about Frank, which was different from missing him, though it was also that. I thought about what he had known and what he had done with what he knew and what it must have cost him to prepare for something he hoped would never be necessary. When Martin came back, he told me the immediate situation was being handled, that the relevant agencies had what they needed to proceed, and that I was free to go. He said it with the careful precision of a man who understood that free to go was not a small phrase and should not be delivered as one. I thanked him. He told me not to thank him yet, that there was more work ahead, and that I should call him in the morning. I said I would. Ryan was still in the back hallway when I gathered my coat and my bag. I don't know if he had arranged it that way or if it was simply how the building was laid out and the timing fell. But as I walked toward the exit, he was there standing near the wall, Diane a few steps behind him, both of them waiting for whatever came next in a process that had stopped being theirs to manage. He looked at me the way people look when they have been preparing for a confrontation and are still prepared for one even though the circumstances no longer support it. His jaw was set. His shoulders were tight beneath his jacket in a way that reminded me, briefly and painfully, of the boy who used to fall asleep in Frank's truck on the way home from job sites. I stopped, not because I owed him anything, not because I thought there was anything left to negotiate, but because there are things that need to be said out loud in order to be fully real, and I had been silent for long enough. "You did this," he said. His voice was low and controlled, which was the version of his voice I had come to trust the least. "You made this into something it didn't have to be." I looked at him for a moment. At the familiar architecture of his face, Frank's jawline, my mother's eyes, the particular combination that had looked up at me from a hospital bassinet 45 years ago and remade the entire shape of my life. "No, Ryan," I said, "you did." Not loudly, not with the satisfaction that people sometimes imagine these moments carry. Just clearly, and with the particular steadiness that comes from saying something you have known for a long time and are finally saying in the right place, to the right person, at the right time. He started to respond. Whatever he intended to say, he didn't finish it. Martin had appeared at my shoulder, quietly and without ceremony, the way good attorneys tend to appear when their presence is most useful. Ryan looked at him, then back at me, and something in his expression shifted not into remorse, not into understanding, but into the recognition that the particular version of this situation he had planned for was no longer available to him. I turned and walked toward the exit. The door opened onto a parking lot under a sky the color of old concrete, the kind of overcast that settles over Portland in the late part of the year and doesn't lift for days. The air was cold and carried the particular clean dampness of a place that had just finished raining and hadn't decided whether it was done. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. After the recycled air of that building, it felt like something I had forgotten I was allowed to have. Carol's car was parked at the far end of the lot, a blue sedan she had owned for 11 years and maintained with the same quiet reliability she brought to everything else. She had found me through Martin, who had called her at my request while I was waiting in the reception area. She was standing beside the driver's door when I came out, and when she saw me, she simply opened the passenger side without making anything of it. I got in. She got in. She started the car. The facility shrank in the side mirror as we pulled out of the lot, and then a turn took it out of view entirely, and Portland opened up around us, familiar streets, familiar sky, the Willamette somewhere to the west behind the low hills. Carol turned the heat on without asking. She merged onto the road heading north. She didn't ask me anything right away. She just drove. And for the first time in months, someone was driving me somewhere I actually wanted to go. Carol's house smelled like coffee and something I hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Not the absence of danger exactly, though that was part of it. Safety in the older sense of the word, the sense that means your surroundings match your interior, that the space you're in is consistent with who you actually are, rather than who someone else has decided you are. I hadn't realized how long I had been living without that, until I stepped through Carol's front door and felt it settle around me like a coat that actually fit. She showed me to the guest room without ceremony. Clean sheets, a quilt her daughter had made, a window that looked out over the herb garden she kept even in winter, the dried stalks of last summer's rosemary and thyme standing in neat rows under the gray afternoon sky. She set a glass of water on the nightstand and said dinner would be whenever I was ready and not before. I lay down on top of the quilt without taking off my shoes and was asleep within minutes. I don't know how long I slept. When I woke, the light through the window had shifted to the particular amber of early evening in late autumn, and the house smelled like something with onions and broth that Carol had been quietly building while I was unconscious. I sat up slowly and looked at the room around me. The ordinary objects of a life well tended: a framed print on the wall, a small bookshelf with paperbacks arranged by color, a ceramic lamp with a warm bulb. None of it mine, and all of it, in that moment, exactly what I needed. I washed my face and went downstairs. Carol had set 2 places at the kitchen table and was ladling soup into bowls without looking up. She asked if I had slept. I said I had. She said good and set a bowl in front of me and sat down across from me, and that was the entirety of the conversation for the first several minutes, which was the right amount of conversation for that particular meal. Martin arrived at 7. Carol let him in, offered him coffee, which he accepted, and then excused herself to the living room with the tact of a woman who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. Martin set his briefcase on the table, accepted the coffee Carol brought before she left, and looked at me across the table, with the expression he wore when he was about to deliver information he had spent the afternoon organizing into the clearest possible shape. He opened his briefcase and took out a folder, set it on the table between us, without opening it yet. "How are you feeling?" he asked first. Not as a formality, Martin Webb had never been a man who asked questions as formalities. "Clear," I said, which was the truest single word I had for it. He nodded. "Then let me tell you what we have." What they had, it turned out, was more than I had reconstructed from a single afternoon with a quarterly binder. The county sheriff's financial crimes unit had been in contact with Martin by late afternoon. The APS investigation had flagged the intake documentation for formal review within hours of the officer's arrival at the facility. And the records I had provided to Martin, the figures I had reconstructed from memory and set down on the backs of old envelopes, had given investigators a specific framework to work from, a set of dates and amounts precise enough to pull corresponding records from the company's actual financial accounts. What those records showed was a pattern that began not 4 months after Ryan took formal control of Callahan & Sons. The withdrawals started small, Martin said, opening the folder to the first page. 2,000, 2,500, spread across different budget categories. Administrative overhead, equipment maintenance, contractor adjustments, nothing large enough to trigger automatic review thresholds. I looked at the page. The figures were laid out in columns, clearly labeled. My own reconstructed numbers appeared in one column beside the official records in another. They aligned almost exactly, which gave me no satisfaction, only confirmation. Over 3 years, Martin continued, the total drawn from the Employee Retirement Fund accounts came to just over $410,000. He paused. The workers whose contributions were affected are still employed by the company. They have not been notified yet, but that will be part of the process. I thought about Pete, the project manager who had shaken my hand with both of his when I came into the office, Dorothy and her banana bread, the foreman and crew members who had worked alongside Frank for 20 years, building things with their hands and trusting that what they put away for the future would still be there when they needed it. "There's more," Martin said. The power of attorney documents Ryan had brought to the notary that morning had been submitted for forensic review. The signatures attributed to me had been compared against authenticated samples from my existing legal records. Martin said the preliminary finding was consistent with what we already suspected. The signatures were not mine. He said it in the careful, precise language of a man who understood the weight of what he was describing and refused to soften it into something easier to hear. He also made contact with a real estate agent, Martin said, turning another page. Preliminary inquiry about listing the property on Southeast Morrison. 3 weeks ago, my house, the house Frank and I had lived in for 31 years, the garden Frank had planted, the kitchen where we had gone over accounts together at the table after dinner. I sat with that for a moment. Not with anger. I had moved through anger some time ago, in the quiet hours when I was still trying to decide what was actually happening. What I felt now was something more like the specific grief of understanding fully, for the first time, the complete scope of what had been planned. "He needed you somewhere you couldn't raise questions," Martin said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "I know," I said. He turned the last page in the folder and was quiet for a moment, looking at it. Then he looked up at me. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into the briefcase, not the folder, a separate section, and withdrew a plain white envelope. Held it in both hands for a moment before setting it on the table between us. "Something Frank asked me to hold for you. My husband was a quiet man. He didn't make speeches, he didn't leave long letters, but he always made sure the important things were written down. I had known that about Frank from early in our marriage. He expressed himself not in words, but in preparation, the company documents drafted and redrafted until every contingency was covered. The household files organized by year, the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket where he wrote things down and crossed them off as he attended to them. He had been preparing for things his entire life. I should not have been surprised that he had prepared for this one too." Martin set the envelope on the table and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been carrying something on behalf of someone else for a long time. "He brought it to me about 8 months before he passed," Martin said. "He asked me to hold it until the time came. He said he hoped the time would never come. Plain white envelope, letter-sized. My name on the front in Frank's handwriting, the block letters, slightly uneven, entirely the same hand I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and blueprint margins for 44 years. "Would you like a moment alone?" Martin asked. "Please," I said. He took his coffee and went to find Carol, and I sat alone at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me. I didn't open it immediately. I sat with it the way you sit with something before you change it, because opening it would change. It would bring whatever Frank had written into the present, where I would have to receive it and carry it forward. I had carried a great deal in 2 years. I wanted one moment before I let this in too. Then I opened it. 2 pages, handwritten. Frank's letters were larger than they used to be, slightly less, even the handwriting of a man whose hands weren't always cooperating, but who was writing carefully regardless. I recognized the effort in it immediately. He had found the discrepancies 14 months before he passed. During a quarterly review he had continued doing even after handing formal control to Ryan, because Frank did not stop doing things he believed needed doing simply because someone else had taken over. He described what he found: precisely the amounts, the categories, the timeline. He had gone back 3 quarters. The pattern was already consistent. He hadn't confronted Ryan directly. He hoped it was an error. Then he hoped Ryan would come to him. Then he understood neither was going to happen. And by then his health had made certain confrontations seem less urgent than certain preparations. So he had prepared, documented everything, given it to Martin with instructions, added protections to the estate plan that would require independent verification before any transfers could be made. He had done all of it quietly, without telling me, because he knew I would have acted immediately. He believed that was not yet the right move. He was right. He was almost always right about timing. Near the bottom of the first page, the handwriting changed slightly more deliberate, as if the sentence had cost him something. "I hope you never have to read this, but if you are, it means Ryan went further than I prayed he wouldn't." I stopped there for a moment. Outside Carol's window, the Portland night was fully dark. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. I looked back at the letter. "You were always the one who kept the books honest, Peggy. I trusted you with that for 35 years and you never let me down. I should have trusted you with this sooner. I'm sorry I thought I could protect you by handling it alone. That was the kind of mistake that comes from loving someone more than I trusted them, and that isn't fair to either of us. Now keep yourself safe. Let the people I've put in place do what they're there to do. I love you. I have loved you since a fundraiser in Northeast Portland in the spring of 1978, and I will love you in whatever comes after this. Frank." I read the last paragraph twice. Then I set the letter down and put my face in my hands. I did not cry dramatically. I cried the way people cry when they are alone and have just been seen completely by someone who is no longer there to see them. Quietly, and with the full weight of everything I had not let myself feel in 8 months: the grief, the exhaustion, and underneath both of those, something I didn't have a clean word for. Something that was partly gratitude and partly the particular ache of being loved by someone who knew you well enough to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Frank had known. He had seen it coming, done everything he could, and loved me through all of it without being able to say so. I sat there while the kitchen clock moved and the house stayed quiet. Eventually, I picked up the letter and read it once more, slowly. Then I folded it along its original creases and held it against my chest with both hands. The warmth of it felt, in some way I couldn't fully explain, like being held. After a while, I heard Martin's footsteps in the hallway. He appeared in the doorway and looked at me with the quiet attention that asks a question without words. I straightened in my chair, set the letter on the table in front of me, still folded, still mine. "What do we do next?" I asked. My voice was steady. Frank would have expected nothing less. Justice, I have learned, is rarely dramatic. It is mostly paperwork, which, as a former accountant, I found oddly appropriate. The formal interview took place 3 days after I left Carol's house, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a county building in downtown Portland that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where difficult things are handled with a ceremony. Martin sat beside me. Across the table were 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit and a representative from the District Attorney's Office, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had spent years turning complicated situations into precise language. I had spent the previous 2 days doing what Frank had always done before any important meeting: preparing. I went through my reconstructed figures one more time, checking them against the official records Martin had shared with me. I reviewed the timeline I had assembled across months of careful observation. I organized everything into the sequence that would be most useful to the people asking the questions, because 35 years of presenting financial findings had taught me that the most important thing you can do in any evidentiary setting is make it easy for the listener to follow the logic. Sandra Okafor opened with a straightforward question. She asked me to describe, in my own words, what I had observed during my visit to Callahan and Sons in March. I told her. Clearly, in sequence, without editorializing. The quarterly binder, the retirement fund disbursements, the pattern across 3 years. Brandon's response when I asked about the supplementary report, the figures I had reconstructed from memory that evening, and how precisely they aligned with the official records now on the table between us. She asked follow-up questions. I answered them the same way. Dates, amounts, specific line items, the structural logic of how the fund had always been managed versus how it had been managed under Ryan's administration. This was the language I had spoken professionally for the better part of 4 decades, and it came back to me in that room the way any fluency comes back without effort, without hesitation, as naturally as breathing. At one point, Sandra Okafor looked up from her notes with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "how long ago did you retire?" 7 years, I said. She nodded slowly. "And you reconstructed this from a single visit?" "I reconstructed the pattern," I said. "The official records confirmed the specifics." She wrote something down. I took that as a good sign. The documentation Frank had left with Martin added a dimension to the investigation that the financial records alone could not. And you provided not just evidence of what had happened, but evidence of when Ryan had first been aware that someone might notice. Frank's notes, precise and dated, established a timeline that the investigators had been able to cross-reference against Ryan's own financial activity in the months following Frank's passing. The picture that emerged was not ambiguous. Ryan had known his father had been reviewing the accounts. He had also known, after Frank's passing, that I remained the one person with both the knowledge and the access to understand what the records showed. The campaign to establish my cognitive decline had begun within 6 months of Frank's passing. The timing, Sandra Okafor noted, was relevant. Diane had agreed to cooperate with the investigation 2 days earlier, Martin told me before we went in. She had retained her own attorney. The details of her cooperation were not something I was privy to, and I did not ask not because I wasn't curious, but because I had learned, across the previous months, that some information was more useful held at a slight distance. What I knew was that she had confirmed the sequence of events leading to that morning at the facility, including the prior arrangement with the intake coordinator and the preparation of documents that had never been authorized by me. The formal charges, when they came, covered 2 distinct areas. The first was financial misappropriation of employee retirement funds, a charge that carried serious consequences under Oregon state law, and that implicated not only Ryan but potentially others who had facilitated the transactions. The second covered what had happened at the facility, the use of fraudulent documentation to attempt an unlawful placement, a charge the district attorney's office had indicated they intended to pursue fully. Martin had explained the likely trajectory of both. There would be more interviews. There would be a formal legal process that would take months, possibly longer. The workers whose retirement contributions had been affected would need to be notified, and the accounts would need to be reconciled. None of it would be quick, and none of it would be simple. I had told him I understood. I had also told him I intended to participate in every step that was available to me, because Frank had built that company with his hands and the trust of the people who worked for him, and if there was a process by which that trust could be partially restored, I was going to be part of it. Sandra Okafor closed her notebook at the end of the interview and thanked me for my time and the clarity of my account. She said it in the professional way that these things are said, without embellishment, but I noticed that she held eye contact a moment longer than the formality required. I took that, too, as a good sign. Martin walked me out through the building's main lobby, past the security desk, and through the glass doors to the front steps. He said he would be in touch within the week. He said I had done well. I thanked him, and he went back inside, because Martin Webb was a man who had other things to attend to, even on days like this one. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the cold air settle around me. Portland in November had a particular quality, not harsh, not dramatic, just consistently, persistently gray in a way that felt honest. The kind of weather that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. I had always appreciated that about this city, even when it tested my patience for 8 consecutive months of cloud cover. The street below was ordinary, people moving between buildings, collars up against the cold, carrying the ordinary business of their days. None of them knew what had just happened in the conference room on the 4th floor. None of them needed to. Somewhere inside that building, 30 years of bad arithmetic was finally being corrected. The house looked exactly the same when I finally came home. Same porch, same garden Frank had planted 20 years ago. Same key in my hand because no one had taken it this time. I stood at the end of the front walk for a long moment before I moved. The November sky was the particular shade of gray that Portland does better than anywhere else. Not threatening, just quiet, like the city itself was holding its breath. The maple in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves, and they lay in soft piles along the edges of the porch steps, undisturbed. Nobody had raked them. I had been gone just over 6 weeks. It felt longer than that. I walked up the 3 porch steps slowly, not because my legs were tired, but because I wanted to feel each one. The second step still creaked the same way it had since 1987, when the wood settled after a particularly wet winter and Frank had said he'd fix it and never quite got around to it. I pressed my foot down on it on purpose this time. The sound was exactly the same. Something in my chest loosened just a little. The key fit the lock on the first try. I don't know what I had expected, that somehow even the house would feel foreign, would resist me. But the door swung open the way it always had, with that slight leftward lean you had to account for. And the smell that met me was so immediately, completely familiar, that I had to stop and breathe it in. Old wood and the faint trace of the cedar sachet I kept in the coat closet, and something underneath it all that I couldn't name but had always been there. It smelled like mine. I set my bag down just inside the door and didn't move for a full minute. The living room was exactly as I had left it. The reading lamp on the side table, the stack of library books I had never returned. I made a mental note about those. The throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch the way I always folded it. I had half expected to find things rearranged, shifted, claimed, but nothing had been touched. I walked to the center of the room and stood there. The afternoon light came through the front window at a low November angle and fell across the floor in long pale strips. I had watched that same light move across that same floor for 31 years. I sat down on the couch, not in the corner I usually claimed, but right in the middle, and I looked around at everything slowly. The framed print above the fireplace that Frank had picked out, the small ceramic bowl on the mantel, where we always dropped loose change, the family photograph taken at Cannon Beach in 2003, back when Ryan was still the young man I had believed in completely. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I looked away. I got up and walked to the kitchen. This was the room that had changed the most while Diane had been coming and going, reorganized cabinets, moved appliances, a new dish rack I had never bought. I opened the cabinet above the coffee maker and found my mugs on the wrong shelf. I moved them back, one by one. It took about 2 minutes. When I was done, I stood back and looked at the cabinet the way it was supposed to look, the way it had looked for 20 years, and I thought, that's a start. I made a cup of coffee and took it to the back of the house. Frank's chair sat in the small sitting room just off the kitchen, angled toward the window that looked out over the garden. It was an old armchair, reupholstered once in the late 90s, wide and deep and slightly worn on the right armrest, where he had rested his hand for years. I had not sat in that chair since he was gone. It had felt like something that belonged to him, a space I was meant to leave open. I sat in it now. The garden was still out there. The raised beds Frank had built were bare for the season, but the structure was intact, the wood dark with moisture, the beds waiting. The rosebush along the back fence had been cut back for winter, just the way Frank always did it in October, which meant at some point earlier in the fall, before everything unraveled. I had done it myself without quite thinking. The muscle memory of 30 years of autumns. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and looked out at all of it, the beds, the fence, the bare branches of the apple tree Frank had planted the year Ryan started high school. I thought about the morning I had stood in that same garden and told Frank I was thinking of going back to work part-time, and he had said, without looking up from the soil. You've never needed my permission for anything, Peg, you know that. I had laughed at the time. I understood it differently now. I sat in that chair for a long time. The house settled around me, the way houses do in the late afternoon. Small sounds, familiar rhythms, the particular silence of a place that knows you. Gradually, without my making any decision about it, the strangeness began to recede. Room by room, minute by minute, the house was remembering me. Or perhaps I was remembering it. By the time the light outside had shifted from pale gray to the deeper color that comes just before dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like I was home. I carried my mug back to the kitchen, rinsed it in the sink, and stood for a moment at the counter. Then I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one Frank had always used for household papers, rubber bands, birthday candles, and the small things that didn't belong anywhere else. His old household ledger was still there, right where he had kept it for 20 years, the cover worn soft with use. I opened it to the last blank page. His final entry was dated 14 months ago, written in his careful, even handwriting, a note about the gas bill, and a reminder to call the plumber about the downstairs sink. I picked up a pen. It was time to write the last entry. Frank used to say that every set of books tells a story. You just have to know how to read it. I thought about that the morning I finally sat down in the garden. It was early, just past 7, the kind of Portland morning in late November where the light arrives reluctantly and the cold settles into everything without apology. I had put on my heavy coat, the charcoal one, the one I had worn through all of it, and carried Frank's ledger outside with a cup of coffee already going cold. I sat in the old iron chair beside the raised beds, the one we had bought at an estate sale in Beaverton in 1998, and I set the ledger open across my knees. The garden was bare but not empty. That is the thing about a garden someone has tended for a long time, even in winter, stripped down to stalks and bare soil and the architecture of things. You can still read the care that shaped it. The rose bush along the back fence, the apple tree, its branches bare and reaching. 20 years of early mornings and muddy gloves and decisions about what to plant where. You could read all of it, if you knew how to look. I looked at the last page of the ledger. Frank's final entry, the gas bill, the note about the plumber sat near the top of the page in his careful handwriting. Below it, the rest of the page was blank, white space that had been waiting. I had thought about what to write for 2 days. In the end, what I wrote was simple, the date and then one line. All accounts settled. The record is honest. I closed the ledger and held it in both hands for a moment. There was a time when I believed that love was enough to protect you, that the people who said they loved you would, when the moment came, choose you over convenience, over money, over fear. I had believed this quietly and completely, without examination, the way you believe in something you have never had reason to question. What the past several months had taught me was that love is not a guarantee. It is a choice that has to be made again, and not everyone keeps making it. The hardest part was learning to hold two things at once, that Ryan had been my son, that there had been real years and real love, and that those years existed alongside everything else, not canceling each other out, just both true, at the same time. That was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a kind of honest accounting, which I suppose was the only way I knew how to process anything. I took a sip of cold coffee and looked out at the apple tree. The week before, I had made a phone call to a woman named Helen Greer, who ran a nonprofit out of Southeast Portland, offering legal support and community resources for older adults who had been through situations like mine. I had found her organization through a pamphlet that Rosa, the nurse who had believed me, had quietly tucked into my coat pocket the morning I left the facility, along with a handwritten note that read, "You were the clearest person in that building. Please use that." I had called Helen on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in my own kitchen, and told her what had happened. When I finished, she said, "We hear this more often than people realize, and most people never speak up." I had thought about those words for days. Most people never speak up. They endure. They doubt themselves. They wonder if perhaps they really are confused, really are the problem because the person telling them so is someone they love. I understood that weight. I had carried it myself, longer than I should have. But I had also learned something worth holding on to. The moment I stopped doubting myself, the moment I trusted what 35 years of careful, honest work had taught me to see everything changed. Not overnight, not without cost, but it changed. That is what I would tell anyone sitting where I once sat. Trust what you know. Trust what you have built. Trust the part of yourself that keeps the books honest, whatever that means for you, whether it is numbers or instinct or the quiet voice that has been trying to get your attention for months. You are not confused. You are not the problem, and you do not have to disappear to make someone else's life easier. The light shifted slowly from gray to something closer to silver, the way it does on the rare Portland mornings when the clouds thin just enough. I thought about Frank, not the Frank of the final months, but the earlier one. The man who checked the weather before every decision, who leveled garden beds until they were exactly right, who had known, quietly and without drama, that something was wrong, and who had done the most frank tease possible in response. He had kept a record. He had prepared. He had trusted me to know what to do with it. If you are listening to this, and something in this story sounds familiar, if you have felt your voice being slowly taken from you, your choices quietly narrowed, your reality, gently but persistently, rewritten by someone who was supposed to love you, I want you to know that what you are feeling is real. There are people who will listen. There are systems that can still work. And there is always something you can do, even if it is only 9 words on a folded piece of paper. You are the one who keeps the books. Don't let anyone change the numbers. I set the ledger down on the garden table and looked out at everything Frank had planted and left behind for me. The books are balanced, Frank. Finally,